Friends, what's going down? So, there's a section on the channel where we do deep dives either into Scientology specifically itself or subjects appertaining to it in the wider world. And it's called Knowledge Report. And we did a video about a month and a half ago called Connecting the Cults Part 1 Manson, Scientology, and the Process Church. Now, I'm getting ready to do Part 2 shortly. And I went back to watch Part 1. And there's so many problems in it. It's loaded with information, but the main problem is that the videos that are played were too choppy and the sound cuts up. And since I was learning how to use the streaming software, the DSLR camera that I'm using now, as opposed to the webcam and all sorts of things, the internet connection was terrible. And there's just too many problems where if I'm going to do a part 2, we need a workable part 1 that people can actually watch without being tortured. So I re-edited this thing. I took out all the as much as I could of the stalling, and particularly the videos are fixed and they're put in properly. So if you've seen it before, I don't know how you got through it, but hopefully this version will be much better. And also, if you haven't seen it, there's a shitload of information covered in this. We cover specifically the cults in the 60s and 70s so we can understand the past, to understand what's happening today. And then in part 2, we're going to go even deeper into it. This is just literally the tip of the iceberg, but there's tons of information in it. So I hope you enjoy. Friends, welcome to another live stream. How are you doing this morning? Well, it's morning. Actually, it's afternoon here, 2 o'clock p.m. What time is it your guys' time? And who do we have in the house? Lady Veritas, nice to see you again, my friend. Catherine Baxter in the house. Goldie with the appropriate We Dig Dug, as we're going to be going deep down into the rabbit hole today. Okay, so let's get started here, because as usual, we have a lot to cover. And we're barely going to get into this, my friends, because what we're doing, if you did your homework, is this is jumping off from the Summer of PSY-OPS kind of mini documentary that's a 2-parter that's on the Raised in a Secret Society series. And I love these live streams because we can go even deeper than spending weeks editing those fucking things and just bust out a live stream covering all the information I wanted to cover. And this is only going to be part 1 of probably about 3, maybe 4 parts, because we're barely going to even get into the beginning of the story, which is Charles Manson. We have to kind of work backwards. And what the hell are we covering today? The cults of the 60s, basically, and all the things that surround that. Specifically, that includes Charles Manson, his connections to Scientology and the Process Church. And that will take us into the 70s when the serial killer phenomena kicks off, and specifically David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam killer. And like I said, there's so many dots to connect that we're going to go slowly and work our way into this. I think we'll really hit our stride in part 2. But the reason being is because, as you can see here, let me remove the chat for a second. We're going to be starting off with Charles Manson. And the story of Charles Manson is an endlessly fascinating one. It's also a story that is difficult to tell in linear fashion, because Charlie and his victims were connected to so many people on so many different levels. And how many of you guys, the craziest conspiracy theory that I have seen over the years is this one by Miles Mathis. I don't know if you guys have read this or not. Let me know in the chat if you have. But this one posits that the Manson murders were actually staged. I don't personally believe that. I've gone back to this document throughout the years, and there's some very interesting anomalies. We might actually cover some of this shit, but it doesn't quite hold water in terms of it being faked. I do believe that the murders happen, but like I said, there's some interesting stuff in here, and I'm sure some of you guys will, in the audience, will know about this. Anyways, where to start here? Where to start? Okay. All right, we're going to start here. Again, we're working backwards. So what on earth does the Son of Sam have to do with fucking Scientology in the process? Son of Sam refers to David Berkowitz. And I'm sure you guys know the story behind him, how supposedly he was the lone killer in the Son of Sam murders in the 70s. Okay, so let's go. So what Son of Sam leaves out about the process and its Scientology connection This is in reference to a documentary that came out May 2021 on Netflix, which is definitely worth watching, although they throw the creator of this, Maitreya, who's the author that this is based on, they throw him under the bus a little bit at the end and kind of try to discredit him. But nonetheless, the book and the documentary series is well worth reading / watching. So I might as well actually show you the trailer first to that, and then I'll read to you the jumping off point, and we can start going deeper into this. You guys are definitely going to hear some interesting information about Scientology, the process, and Manson today. But we're just getting started in a certain way. So here's the trailer.
Run from me, darling.
A killer on the loose in New York for a year and 3 days.
Run, my good.
He is David Berkowitz, the man police believe to be the son of Sam.
You better run for your life.
They totally ignored the true story of this case.
Run.
Once they named Berkowitz, it was like, hallelujah, we got our bad guy. Everybody can walk the streets again.
The city of New York can rest easy.
Run.
There were real questions in this case.
Why do the police not investigate more? The sketches don't add up. You're not going to mistake Berkowitz for being 6 feet tall and blonde.
You got suspects dying accidentally.
There were 8 attacks. Did you do all of them?
I did not pull the trigger at every single one of them.
The worst serial killer in New York City didn't do it on his own. This is freaking huge.
Son of Sam is not over. Son of Sam still exists.
Berkowitz is claiming members of a satanic cult helped in the murders of 6 people.
I could feel a force pulling me into the darkness.
This group is all over the country.
They were devoted to bringing on the end of the world.
Is there a link between the Manson killings and the Son of Sam killings?
Maury wanted the truth to come out, but nobody would listen.
This case went off the rails a little bit.
People are scared that this is still happening.
With Berkowitz in prison. Who's still out there?
You better run for your life.
So what the hell does that have to do with what we're talking about? Let us get into it. So here we go. What Son of Sam leaves out about the process and its Scientology connection. Now that's in reference to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which, as you'll learn about, is an offshoot of Scientology. The Sons of Sam introduces viewers to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, and here's what the Netflix documentary leaves out about the movement, supposedly. You guys might recognize that from the thumbnail. The Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, introduces viewers to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, but a lot gets left out about the movements and its roots in Scientology. Netflix docuseries is largely told from the perspective of journalist Maitreya, who dedicated his life to the Son of Sam case, hoping to prove that David Berkowitz didn't act alone. Terry's research into the alleged cult members John and Michael Carr, who Berkowitz claimed were co-conspirators to his crimes, revealed a past link to the Scientology Church and an offshoot branch known as the Process Church. Now, before we get deeper into this, Michael Carr was a high-level Scientologist. He's the one that supposedly introduced David Berkowitz to the Son of Sam cult, which is an offshoot of the Process, which is an offshoot of Scientology. He got a suppressive declare from Hubbard, got booted out, and joined, like I said, allegedly, an offshoot of the Process Church. I hope that makes sense so far. So, Terry believed that the New York branch of the Process Church spawned a satanic cult called the Children. And as you'll see, that might be more along the lines of an offshoot called the 4 Ps of the Process, or the Chingon. And Netflix true crime documentary examines Maitreya's theory that several members of the cult were behind the 1970s killing spree attributed to the Son of Sam. There's more to the process and its connections in Scientology than what gets explained in the Sons of Sam. In the early 1960s, newly married Scientologists Marianne McLean and Robert DeGrinston used the skills they acquired while training to become auditors for the Church of Scientology, along with L. Ron Hubbard's E-meter, to create a rogue offshoot of the church originally called Compulsions Analysis. The group's initial ideology blended together therapeutic processes, hence the name, borrowed from Scientology and ideas from psychotherapist Alfred Adler, and he was covered in that little diagram that I showed you from Scientology, who helped establish the field of psychoanalysis alongside Sigmund Freud before breaking away from the movement to found the Society for Individual Psychology in 1912. And just to show you some of the processes that they used, no pun intended, and how much they are like Scientology, I'm going to show you some footage that was put out by a really hard to find movie from the cult itself called Sympathy for the Devil. And so it's kind of a PR puff piece by the cult, but there is some interesting information in it. And you can also see some of the processes that were used by this cult.
I was afraid. I didn't know what to expect. I'd had no experience about any kind of psychological anything, really. I went into this room, and this was my first experience of the group. 2 rows of chairs. You have to look at the other person real close, without blinking.
They were into truth games, so, after a lot of gazing, you were supposed to say exactly what you felt about that person.
And you're supposed to just be very, very open and and not react,
I mean, the face opposite me is about here.
You had really to find something, either physical or psychological detail that would get in.
You've got a pretty stupid-looking face.
The pimple on your nose is gross.
I mean, really, just the way your eyebrows droop.
You have scum in the corner of your eye.
That nose is kind of absurd, just sitting there in the middle of your face.
You stink.
I mean, really, anyone could look at you and think, wash out, right? It was really, really, really tough to take.
To be asked this, compared to the culture where you never said something direct. Never. You didn't say that in public to a stranger.
The idea is basically to flatten out the reactivity. And there are not many ways in life that you can actually push yourself to the limit in order to learn to master what comes out when you're pushed to the limit.
Yep, that's what I used to say in justifying Scientology. I remember even talking about that with who the fuck was it? I think Andrew Gold, where he didn't see a problem with that because we tried to actually do some of that bull baiting that you just saw in an interview that we did a while ago, and it's just it seems like it can help you out, but I would say that it's breaking down the boundaries. And then here's another example of more Scientology in the process.
There's no question in my mind that Robert de Grimston was channeling something. Robert's writing is fantastic. It has some quality that bypasses the usual linguistic filters and works directly on the nervous system. This world of men is a place of darkness and misery and pain and anguish and hatred and failure. For the world of men is hell.
You guys might know that guy. He's Genesis P. Orridge. I'll put a video in the description box where you can link to him. He's a very interesting character, and he sounds so much like when he speaks, because he kind of formed his own cult around his rock band. When he speaks, he sounds like the same word salad that L. Ron Hubbard does.
Humanity is the devil.
The presence, the feeling there was very powerful. The thing is, I knew it was a brainwashing cult, and I thought, this is interesting. What would they do to make me turn out like them?
They were all very, very thin, and they had this kind of very recognizable mannerism of the unblinking eye.
I gather that they were under the impression that they were communicating telepathically with one another, so there was this kind of super mind going on in the middle of Mayfair.
This is a session, and what I will be doing...
Here's their session, man. They do it telepathically. This is totally against the auditor's code, where they actually evaluate for the pre-clear.
What I will be doing is asking a question, and then I will receive telepathically from you the answer.
For what was
then the equivalent of almost a week's wage for me for 1 hour, I would sit one side of a desk with a notepad and pen, being asked questions by the telepath.
The first question is, what is your most immediate problem?
He would ask me the question, I would think about it, realizing I wasn't expected to give an answer, and then he would tell me the answer that he had elicited from my unconscious.
Not having enough time.
And I would dutifully write it down.
Okay. So why are you not having enough time?
I mean, it sounds bonkers, but I learn things about myself.
I have too many things to do.
Which I may have learned in other ways, but I learn things through those sessions.
How does that serve you by having too many things to do? It keeps me from doing anything.
That must look absolutely absurd, but it's just weird how much that guy sound like an indie processian where, yeah, I got something out of the tech. You know, it did seem to happen. Maybe I couldn't have gotten it elsewhere. Who knows, right? Anyways, back to this. So there's more to the process and its connections to Scientology than what gets explained in The Sons of Sam. In the early 1960s, newly married Scientologists Mary Ann McLean and Robert de Grimstead used the skills they acquired while training to become auditors for the Church of Scientology, along with L. Ron Hubbard's e-meter, to create a rogue offshoot of the church originally called compulsions analysis. The group's initial ideology blended together therapeutic processes, hence the name, borrowed from Scientology, and the ideas from psychotherapist Alan Adler, and we already read that. Eventually, compulsions analysis formed its own theology centered around 4 gods: Jesus. Robert de Grimstead was the only one, the leader, that was allowed to be Jesus. Jehovah, Lucifer, and Satan, which has led some religious scholars to define the process as a form of Satanism as seen in the Sons of Sam. By 1966, the process had become a legitimate church with chapters established in at least 4 countries, including the New York chapter covered in the Netflix documentary. As the process became increasingly evangelistic, it began issuing a glossy magazine also called The Process, a surprisingly groundbreaking example of independent publishing of the time with frank issue topics. Like Scientology, The Process also garnered attention from celebrities during the height of its movement in the 60s and 70s, including Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull. And Marianne Faithfull had to be kind of rescued from the cult because her parents were worried about her. It's also true that the Process Church grew. Members began to create new, offset factions of the movement. Again, they splinter off, just like this is a splinter from Scientology, which is where Maitreya's theory about the children came from, though the connection remains difficult to prove. The so-called Processians also denied any connection to the Manson family, despite the fact that many people believe Manson was influenced by the process, as Netflix's Sons of Sam: A Descent into Darkness portrays. He definitely was influenced by the process, and we'll be getting into that. Process magazine editor Malachi McCormick explained how the Manson rumor got started. According to Art Forum, McCormick claimed that the Church of Scientology spread the rumor because, according to McCormick, quote, McLean and de Grimstead had stolen the tech, the e-meter, and were considered apostates by Hubbard. The rumors hurt the movement, which declined in popularity after the Manson murders. If what McCormick claims is true, in this way at least, the process never did manage to escape its Scientology roots. I don't think that that's quite accurate, because Scientology would be taking one hell of a chance by trying to discredit him in that fashion. But here's an internal memo. You might find this interesting. About let me just say something real quick. They had to put out so many fires because of this Process Church, because they were not only being linked to Manson, but as you see, David Berkowitz, and you'll understand why as we go. But they fair game Maitreya, set up a whole fair game campaign against him. He's the one that wrote this book. Let me grab it. This book is called The Ultimate Evil: The Search for the Sons of Sam. And it's kind of a huge book, and it's a hell of a fascinating read. I would say use discernment. It's probably not all accurate, but this is the book that kind of started the series and the conspiracy theory about all this. And Scientology has constantly had to put out fires, whether it was having to do with Bruce Davis, David Berkowitz, Charles Manson, and a host of other characters. So check this out. This is an internal memo of this kind of coming up and them having to deal with it. The following is text of an actual internal memo recovered from Scientology during the 1977 raid by the FBI of Scientology's headquarters at that time in Los Angeles. Dear Mary Sue, that's in reference to Mary Sue Hubbard. Compliance report, re Manson and Bruce Davis. There have been numerous new developments on this case, and they are as follows. An individual by the name of Steve Grogan appeared on our lines. Steve Grogan was a member of the Manson family, and he was an ex-Scientologist, as well as Bruce Davis and Paul Watkins. And as we are going to come to learn, Manson was heavily involved in Scientology as well. I received word that he had made statements that he was a member of Manson's family and therefore started some intel action, which at first consisted of talking to the girls he had been in contact with. By the time I had finished talking to them, Grogan had been put away in jail for car theft. In spite of numerous efforts on our part, it was impossible to get together with him. I had the girl he seemed to be most in calm with, that means communication, journey out to the valley on 4 different occasions to talk to him. And in spite of our best efforts, he was never made available. He was either in court or the jail was undergoing extensive redecoration. Of course, we did not want it known that a member of the church was trying to see him. At the same time this was going on, we received word that 2 members of the Manson family, Squeaky Fromm and Sandy Good, were staying at the Viking Hotel on 3rd and Alvarado, which is in close proximity to the org. We made no efforts to contact them. Let me blow this up a little bit. Okay, on 18 June 80, the following report was received by me. According to Rawl arrived in prison on McNeil Island, Washington in 1962 and became a cellmate of Lafayette Ramier. I don't know if it's Ramier or Ramier. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but that's the guy who introduced Manson to Scientology. Allegedly a trained Scientology auditor. He is a trained Scientology auditor, and he received something called the Doctor of Scientology at the time, which was a certificate that they don't give out anymore. A trained auditor about level 1 in Raoul's estimation, and was introduced to Scientology at that time. Ramier was auditing in prison at that time, and in one 10-man cell had managed to gather a group of about 7, all in Scientology. Charles Manson entered later and studied, did TR0, etc., along with his cellmates, and received approximately 150 hours of auditing from Ramier. Let me throw the chat up here because you guys don't necessarily need to see that. So what he did was TR0, along with his cellmates, he received approximately 150 hours of auditing from Ramier. Processes used were CCHs, help process, who have you helped and who have you not helped, and other dichotomy processes. Raoul's terms such as what can you confront and what would you rather not confront. Havingness, such as what can you have? Look around and find something you can have. Look around and find something you're not in. Ramier kept records of his auditing. Manson got super energetic and flipped out when he'd been audited and would, for a time, talk about nothing but Scientology to the extent that people avoided his company. Yeah, no shit. After a while, however, Manson was screaming to get away from his auditor, and that's because he was severely overrun. That means if you run a process too long, they do something in Scientology called red tagging you. This happened many times when I was doing sessions. If you go too far beyond a win, or what they call a floating needle, you can really go out of your mind. And they have 24 hours to get you back in. They put a red tag on your folder. Otherwise, you might go crazy. You have psychotic breaks often in Scientology, and this is their way of getting you back in to fix it, get you back in the trance state, remember the win or the high, and then you won't go out and form your own Manson-esque cult. Okay, he eventually managed to get put in solitary confinement to get away from his auditor. This is why Manson says Scientology is too crazy for him, because they literally drove him crazy. Eventually, prison officials got suspicious of the group's strange activities and broke up the group. Subsequently, Rawl was released from the prison in 1965, and Ramier's wife was in training here at the LA Org in 1965 to 1966. She had disconnected from Ramier. Rawl just found out yesterday that another friend, Marvin White, later sent Manson's books after the Scientology group was broken up on hypnotism and black magic. That's appropriate enough. Now here we get into some other anomalies that are around Bruce Davis, who was an ex-Scientologist at the time that he joined the family, and he also had connections to the Process Church. This is from Bugliosi's best-selling novel Helter Skelter, which compared to Tom O'Neill's book is because you kind of take Tom O'Neill, if you guys have read Chaos, basically takes Bugliosi's book apart and shows kind of what a fraud he was. But nonetheless, there's a lot of interesting information in Helter Skelter. The bodies of James Sharp, 15, and Doreen Gall, 19, were found in an alley in downtown Los Angeles. The two teenagers have been killed elsewhere with a long-bladed knife or bayonet, then dumped there. Each had been stabbed over 50 times. See, man, this is why we got to have some music in the background or try to lighten things up, because trigger warning, this is kind of heavy. Ramparts Division Lieutenant Earl Deemer investigated the Sharp Gall murders, as did Los Angeles Times reporter Cohen. Although this is not, let me actually turn this off. It's not appropriate. Both James Sharp and Doreen Gall were Scientologists, the latter a Scientologist clear, who had been residing in a Church of Scientology house. According to unconfirmed reports, Doreen Gall was a former girlfriend of Manson family member Bruce Davis, himself an ex-Scientologist. Davis's whereabouts at the time of the murders of Sharp, Gall, and Jane Doe 59 are not known. He disappeared shortly after being questioned in connection with the death of Zero. On December 1st, 1969, Joel Dean Pugh, husband of family member Sandy Good, was found with his throat slit in a London hotel room. As noted, local police ruled the death a suicide. On learning of Pugh's demise, Inyo County DA Frank Fowles made official inquiries, specifically asking Interpol to check visas to determine if one Bruce Davis was in England at the time. Scotland Yard replied as follows, quote, "It's been established that David is recorded as embarking at London Airport for the United States of America on April 25th, 1969, while holding a United States passport, blah, blah, blah. At this time, he gave his address as Dormer Cottage, Felbridge, Surrey. This address is owned by the Scientology movement and houses followers of this organization. From Paulette Cooper's The Scandalous Scientology, another bit of publicity that the Scientologists are probably not too pleased with concerns the murder of 3 people in Los Angeles. 2 were Scientologists." And then I'll go ahead and link this in the description box because we have a lot more to cover, but here's more murders. But Bruce Davis has been loosely tied to, or let's just say he was suspected but never convicted of those 2 murders. Scientology played an important part in the lives of Charles Manson and Bruce Davis. There's documented evidence regarding the teachings of Scientology to Manson even while he was incarcerated during the 1950s. It's reported Charles Manson reached a level of clear and was rather astute in his adoption of control and manipulation techniques when dealing with other people. Manson used Scientology to answer questions with Diane Sawyer during the ABC television broadcast. Manson often expressed the concept of living in the, quote, now, and the term was used to describe the murder of Shorty Shea when the killer said it was hard to bring Shorty to the now. Bruce Davis was an emissary for Manson when he traveled to England to work out problems between the process and Scientology. Davis denied to the BBC reporter Bill Murphy that he ever traveled to Manchester, England, despite the fact witnesses saw him there. Murphy had an acquaintance who actually witnessed Bruce Davis traveling around Manchester with a coven of witches. Murder victims Doreen Gall and James Sharps were deeply involved in the Church of Scientology, and it was documented that James Sharp conducted instruction to Doreen Gall the night of the murder. He was taking Miss Gall to the level of clear, and Gall was also working on engrams at the time of her murder. Bruce Davis lived in the same communal residence as Doreen Gall, while he was very active in Scientology. The owner of the residence was the Church of Scientology. Now, just prior to the murder of Doreen Gall, she made a telephone call to her father asking for an airplane ticket home. Mr. Gall told Doreen he would send her a round-trip ticket. She responded that it should be a one-way ticket. Said Gall to her father, quote, "I think this stuff is all a bunch of horseshit." She was leaving the Church of Scientology, and the fact was documented by a friend of Doreen Gall who resided in New York, who had offered her a job. For whatever reason, the Church of Scientology has played a very important part in the Manson saga. The Church of Scientology even offered a reward for the arrest and conviction of the persons responsible for the murder of Doreen Gall and James Sharp, perhaps to cover their own ass, right? Susan Atkins stated that a, quote, man used to come up to Goler Wash and have meetings with Manson. Quote, "I believe he was with the Church of Scientology," said Atkins. Paul Crockett, Paul Watkins, and other Manson family associates spoke of the influence of Scientology on Manson. Best-selling author Ed Sanders made some statements about Scientology and the Process Church, in his first edition of The Family. Legal action caused Sanders to remove that portion of his book and the subsequent editions. Scientology is an important part of the Manson story. I actually have that chapter that's missing. You can only get in an English version, and it costs like $400 to buy. I'll put the whole English version of that book in PDF form on the actual in the description box after we're done. Okay, that leads us to Goler Wash, which is just being talked about here. Around the 1st of March 1969. This is kind of like the I think we lost the camera again. This is kind of like the indie Scientologist battle. Like Manson was rejected from Scientology. Once he got out of prison, he went to San Francisco and he wanted to kind of sign up and become a Scientologist, but they declared him type 3, which means he's psychotic. So despite being rejected, he taught this philosophy and used a lot of the techniques with his flock. And Paul Watkins was able to get out from the Freudian slip, from Manson's control by meeting an indie Scientologist at Goyer. Well, let me just read this. It's quite interesting, but they're kind of like a battle of the indie Scientologists and shit that was going on between Manson and the person that got Paul Watkins out of the cult and others. Okay, so around the 1st of March, 1969, two miners named Paul Crockett and Bob Berry arrived at the Barker Ranch to find Brooks Poston and Juanita living there following the marijuana raid. Bob Berry had visited the Barker Ranch area the preceding autumn and evidently had enjoyed himself. Crockett, this is the guy, the indie Scientologist. Crockett, an articulate gentleman in his 50s, filled with the lore of Scientology, left his home in Carlsbad, New Mexico to come to Goler Wash for the purpose of discovering gold. Bob Berry and Paul Crockett began to stay in the small tar-roofed cabin to the left of the main Barker Ranch house. The two began to scour old mining sites at the Panamint Mountains, Wingate Wash, and South Endora Canyon in order to look into the Mother Lode. By night, Berry and Crockett would sit and chat with Brooks and Juanita, and later Paul Watkins when he returned from Los Angeles. One thing that struck the miner/metaphysician, Paul Crockett, was the enormous fear that Paul Watkins and Juanita and Brooks had for this mysterious Charlie. It came to pass that Paul Crockett hired, for board, Brooks Poston to help haul one down from the hillsides. It's common for miners to engage someone to bring weekly shipments of supplies via Jeep to their claims on their camps for blah, 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 blah. Okay, so Crockett upped his food order to accommodate the thin, young, trance-prone Texas Poston. They would go out by day to inspect old mine sites, old diggings, and outcroppings, hauling one samples back to the ranch when they returned at dusk, or samples back when they returned from dusk. They would crunch up the samples in a rock-breaking machine that could chew the mineral into 40 pieces per cubic inch. Sometime in the spring, little Paul Watkins traveled to Death Valley where he visited Juanita and Brooks and met Crockett. Little Paul returned to the Spawn Ranch to announce the horrible news that, quote, Scientologists had taken over the Barker Ranch. News which triggered off a fearful reaction within the family. Oh no, the indie Scientologists are going to take over. Watkins persuaded Charlie to let him go back up to Barker Ranch, perhaps to keep an eye on the so-called Scientologists looking for the mother lode. Several times during these spring months of 1969, this is right before he gets caught, and they're out at Goler Ranch, or Goler Wash. Manson and the others tried to drive up to the Barker Ranch, but it always seemed that something went wrong. Which beams were thwarting them? Or were the so-called Scientologists keeping the family away? Paul Crockett certainly didn't do anything to dispel the illusion that he was preventing the family from coming up there by means of his mental powers. In fact, he was promoting the idea that he could establish a magical warp to prevent Manson from returning to harm those remaining in Death Valley. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's literally like a battle of the Scientologists out there in Death Valley for who gets to retain the flock right before Charlie's about to go to prison and this shit's about to break. The family seems to have begun to believe that occult beings and powers were attempting to prevent them from returning to Holy Devil's Hole. Even Manson, ever a beamphobe. This is Ed Sanders talking, by the way, in the book, The Family. Again, there's a free PDF version that'll be in the description box. Evidently held some belief in Crockett's power. Paul Watkins, so he claims, decided at the advent of various murderous schemes to get out of the family. So he placed himself in the tutelage of Paul Crockett. Quote, he, Crockett, knows how Charlie set up his whole thing. And I went to Paul, help me out of this. Blam, just like that, I was hung right up in it. And using processing and looking at what it is, i.e. as ising it, as they say in Scientology, I was able to be free from it. But old Clem, Sandy, Lynn, and Gypsy, there ain't no way they can get free from that. I mean, they could snuff Charlie out and they're still stuck to him. Very, very interesting. And here's a little video from this amazing Manson movie that talks a little bit about the Scientology wars and shit that were going on.
While at Barker's Ranch, a man named Paul Crockett and another drove into the yard.
On the night that I arrived, I met Brooks Poston. They were living in the big house on the ranch. We would go and stay in the cabin that was just to the left of the house. We would sit in the evenings and talk, and we began to learn and hear about Charlie.
Paul had offered me a job to go up and down the mountains and to help him get gold ore down from some mines that they had in that area.
I got Brooks to go and work with me, and then Paul Watkins came. Every day we would go and inspect old mine sites, old diggings, and I could explain to them what Charlie was doing. That it was ridiculous, it was idiotic, that it had no value whatsoever to them. And they decided to quit Charlie and come and go with me.
Later on, when Charlie and the crew came back up to the desert and we were there, I watched him and Crockett do this little dance of the gurus. And it just seemed to me that Paul's stuff packed more reality than Charlie's. That was my way out.
I had no one to go back to, and everybody else had given up their families.
Okay, so that's it on that. Now, here's another little interesting thing that I found. And we're going to, like I said, at the very end, we're kind of working our way to the beginning of the story. I just wanted to give you some tidbits. I just wanted to give you guys some tidbits to show you the influence of Scientology, to introduce you to the process. But we are actually going to get to Charles Manson by doing some backfooting here. And here's another little interesting thing. A slip by David Miscavige, where he actually, you see that letter that I told you, or that I showed you earlier before, and how Maitreya himself, you know, who wrote The Ultimate Evil, he was also getting fair game. We'll cover that in part 2. As soon as Scientology gets wind that Manson, who they know is a Scientologist, you know, might cause a PR flap, they set up all sorts of programs to get intel on the family and people. And part of that, I don't think David Miscavige is too privy to that. This would have been in the 60s and maybe up to the early 70s. So he's not nearly as smart and clever as Hubbard. This is Hubbard's doing. And David Miscavige slipped up in one of the events and talked about the Process Church, even though he didn't use the correct names. That either shows that how clueless he is about the connection, or that he's trying to kind of hide it. So let me show you this little clip. First of all, process history goes kind of like this. So let me just read this. This is Ixtul. Ixtul is a small village in the state of Yucatan, Mexico. It is on the North Gulf of Mexico, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's in Yucatan, Mexico. And the village, like a few others located on the Gulf Coast, was a location where okay, that doesn't matter. Ixtul is noted as a location where some 30 members of the Process Church of the Final Judgment went in 1966. They set up camp in an abandoned salt factory while they were hit with a Hurricane Inez. The resulting storm lasted for 3 days. It was during this time that the basic theology of the Process Church was formed and later written as the Ixtul Dialogues. And again, the Process Church of the Final Judgment documentary is on my BitChute channel. There'll be a link in the description so you can see the whole Ixtul, where they basically came up with their philosophy. And here's David Miscavige talking about it in a clip to his
Probably
vlog.
the best example of
Let me pull that back.
Probably the best example of the vicious nature of these false reports is a document written by David Forsyth, who was posted in IRS Intelligence Branch. The report was written in 1974 and was an attempt to smear the church internationally and wipe it out. At the time the report was written, the church had coincidentally purchased a ranch in Mexico as a boarding school for the children of Sea Org members in Southern California. In other words, the ranch was occupied by 6-year-olds. But in Forsyth's report, he stated, a group of Scientologists is currently training in guerrilla warfare near the town of Uxtal on the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay, that's obviously Extal, shows how misinformed he is, but there it is, the Yucatan Peninsula. And I'm going to play that again because this is very interesting what he says. Maybe someone can decode it in the comment section afterwards, but it's just an example of their interaction with these groups and having to deal with them. And what's up with him saying these 6-year-olds on a ranch? You know, isn't that what Scientology does in their boarding schools? Just ask Laura FM.
Probably the best example of the vicious nature of these false reports is a document written by David Forsyth, who was posted in IRS Intelligence Branch. The report was written in 1974 and was an attempt to smear the church internationally and wipe it out. At the time the report was written, the church had coincidentally purchased a ranch in Mexico as a boarding school for the children of Sea Org members in Southern California. In other words, the ranch was occupied by 6-year-olds. But in Forsyth's report, he stated, a group of Scientologists is currently training in guerrilla warfare near the town of Uxtal on the Yucatan Peninsula.
What a sick fuck, man. While he's doing the same things to the other kids. Okay, let me turn this off. Stand by. You guys want to watch this instead? Okay, so one other little thing to show you before we actually get into Charles Manson here. Just another connection with Bruce Davis, the Process Church, and to try to set some groundwork as we go forward so we don't get totally lost when we really jump into this on this next article. So Manson seems to have stayed on Topanga Lane at the mouth of Topanga Canyon by the ruins of the Spiral Staircase. The Spiral Staircase is where the family, when they were more innocent, first met the Process. And according to Charlie's own biography, that's when they kind of started to go crazy, when they met members of the Process and were witnessing what they were doing versus their innocent peace and love hippie type thing. That's according to Manson, so I guess we have to take that with a grain of salt, but we do know that they first met the Process at the Spiral Staircase in Topanga Canyon. The Spiral Staircase house where Manson and crew had stayed a year previous had subsequently been demolished. Manson was living in a blue bus parked by the ruins. Manson was seen at a Thanksgiving dinner at Lane Wooten's house in Topanga Canyon on November 28, 1968. In early December 1968, Manson sent Ace Acidian. This is Ed Sanders trying to be cool. He's basically talking about Acid Head, Bruce Davis, on a trip to England where he spent around 5 months, including considerable time at the London headquarters of the Process. The Process had a London headquarters that wasn't too far away from the London headquarters of what will become Scientology's Saint Hill, I believe, or East Grinstead. Little Paul described it as being a go-to Rio and get me a coconut scene, where Manson told Davis to take a trip around the world and report back. Whatever the case, Bruce Davis, with 2 traveling companions, journeyed to England by way of North Africa. There is also a story fitting about that Davis took a collection of 500 silver dollars over to England to sell. People that have intimate knowledge of the Tate LaBianca case will see an interesting possibility if, in fact, David did transport the silver to Great Britain. So in London, Davis approached the Church of Scientology to pursue courses of study. He was employed by the Church of Scientology for a short time, working in their mailroom. The Church of Scientology fired Davis after a couple of weeks when he wouldn't stop using drugs, they say. According to a homicide investigator extremely close to the case, Bruce Davis then began to hang out with the Process Church at the Final Judgment at their Mayfair townhouse. Later, when he returned from London to the Spawn Ranch, Davis was talking and whooping about the Hitler-loving satanic organization. Okay, so let's get into the man himself and start from the beginning. Actually, let's take a quick break here. See what you guys are up to in the chat. Scientology seems to like the desert. Indeed. I don't like the looks of these people at all. Yeah, I hear you, Catherine. Which people in particular? Welcome, Sean. Sorry I'm late. I really enjoyed the last one on the actress from the Blue Light. Yeah, that was an article that was put out by Tony Ortega via the, what was that? The Daily Beast. And it's an amazing little gem of reporting by him, man, talking about the connections. That was a previous broadcast. I'll link that in the description as well. Yeah, Niram, I would say that that's definitely what this is all about. And you know what? Well, I guess we'll get into that later. Let's get into Charlie, because we got quite a bit of reading here. This will probably be about a 15-minute read, and it's from David. Let me show you what this is from, because all these books are definitely worth reading. And there's free PDF versions. This is how I learned about all this shit when I was like homeless, trying to fucking figure this crap out about what the hell happened to me in Scientology. And then before you know it, I'm going down this rabbit hole. Oh, by the way, shit, we just lost the camera. I wanted to say something real quick. Stand by. Okay, the people that did that little clip on the David Miscavige X-Stool process thing that you saw, those are the McClurthys. And I'm going to leave a link in the description box because I believe they're having some trouble with their living arrangements. And I've set up a GoFundMe for help. And they're one of only two people that I can think of in the ex-Scientology community that actually go down these rabbit holes. And they have done some incredible research. And I'll link you to their blog, which is full of this stuff. The only other one I can think of is Arnie Lerma, the late Arnie Lerma, RIP. Maybe I'm forgetting someone, but I love these guys' research and people that will kind of give the bigger picture, because this is what I was looking for when I was coming out of Scientology myself. And I think it's what you need to understand to have a full recovery. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, so I said I was going to show you that book, so let me show it to you. Again, this is covered on the series, and this is Programmed to Kill. It's called The Politics of Serial Murder. I don't know if you can see all the serial killers that are on there. By Dave McGowan. He's the one that also did Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon that we talked about last time. Now, this book was written in 2004. He died an untimely death, some say from smoking. He died in his 50s, and some say there's a conspiracy behind that. I don't know personally. But it's amazing that he wrote this in 2004. And if you want a book that connects a lot of dots from the serial killers to what Niram was talking about the CIA covert ops, this whole area and the serial killers and the false memory syndrome and all this incredible stuff, this is one book where you can really get a lot out of it. And if he was with us today, it would be amazing to have him update this and see what he can come up with, because it's one of the top books, in my opinion, and a lot of people, to start trying to understand this complex dot connecting maze, basically. So enough rambling and back to this. So this is from Dave McGowan. Charles Mills Manson was born no-name Maddox, the son of an alcoholic teenage prostitute. His mother was imprisoned for armed robbery when Charles was just a toddler, so the boy was sent to live with his grandparents. Following that, he lived for a time with an aunt and uncle in Virginia, who sent him off to his first day of school dressed as a girl, just as Henry Lee Lucas's mother had done. By age 8, Charlie was back with his mother, who occasionally sent him off to stay with a moonshiner uncle. At age 9, he was sent to stay at the Gibraltar Home for Boys, a, quote, reform school in Cherry Hill, Indiana. 3 years later, the preteen boy was living alone in a single room at a boarding house until he was discovered by authorities. How he came to be living alone remains something of a mystery. From that point on, Manson spent the vast majority of his life institutionalized. So he's already getting set up in these government-funded, shady-ass schools, traumatized by being told to wear a dress. And perhaps this forms his narcissism and his desire to figure out a way to survive the abuse and rebel. I'm not justifying Manson's behavior at all, my friends. It's just interesting. Well, you could perhaps see like why his formation and why he would maybe become what he became. Charles next found himself housed at Boys Town, and that's an infamous place that's identified in the Franklin cover-up as a cesspool of pedophilic operations. By the age of 15, Charles was no longer a ward of the state. He had graduated to being a full-fledged convict. In prison, the diminutive Manson was repeatedly raped and beaten by guards and fellow inmates until he managed to escape at the age of 16 and find his way to California. What a shitty way to start your life out. He was soon arrested again and sent to the rather ominous named National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. A few years later, he was set free and married briefly and fathered a child who also worked as a pimp. That occupation earned him a lengthy prison stay following a conviction for running an interstate vice ring. 7 years later, he was again set free after reportedly following Henry Lee Lucas's lead by begging authorities at Terminal Island Prison not to release him. Now, he gets out of prison at this point, and I want to show you some of the shenanigans before we get into his, him getting out of prison, what he was kind of getting up to in prison right before his release. So here's some of the things he was actually doing, and it kind of reminds me of Hubbard. Manson was many things, not just a Scientologist. He grabbed, like Hubbard, from everything, especially hypnotism and the occult. So it was while counting the days at McNeil Island that Manson began studying music, warlockery, hypnotism, astral projection, Masonic lore, Scientology, ego games, subliminal motivation, music, and perhaps Rosicrucianism. Again, we showed you the kind of Venn diagram of how Rosicrucianism fits into Scientology, especially hypnotism and subliminal motivation. He seemed determined to use it to effect control over others to his benefit. One prison mate of Manson at McNeil Island recalls vividly the great Charlie Manson headphones caper. This is kind of funny shit that he was getting up to. Practicing his hypnosis skills. That's another thing that you're going to see, probably in part 2, where he was definitely training and became kind of an expert hypnotist, just like Hubbard, because that's the best way to access the subconscious mind and easily take over someone's mind without their awareness. One prison mate of Manson at McNeil recalls vividly the Charlie Manson headphone caper. Utilizing the prison radio station, Manson planted what his cell partner called post-hypnotic suggestions in all the prisoners at McNeil Island Penitentiary. Each prisoner had access to the station by means of headphones hanging on the bunk beds in the cells. Manson set up a clandestine scheme whereby the radio station would broadcast messages at 3 a.m. over the headphones. The message or instruction was repeated over and over. The prisoners were required to hang their headsets at night on the bedstand so that the messages were picked up by the sleepers but were not loud enough to attract the guards. The story continues that McNeil Island had a basketball team that rarely won games. Manson beamed messages to the sleeping inmates, urging them to get out and to root for the McNeil Island team. Charlie then placed bets with the zealous new fans that the opposing team would win and quickly won himself 200 frickin' packs of cigarettes, the medium of exchange in U.S. prisons. Another was the applause caper. He planted suggestions over the earphones that everyone should keep applauding for Manson when he sang at a particular prison talent contest. Manson won the contest earphones down, evidently receiving a standing ovation of some duration. Of irony, Manson seems to have become a protege in prison of Prohibition gangster Alvin Creepy Karpis, a member of the evil Ma Baker gang, which left 14 victims dead. Alvin, Old Creepy Karpis, taught Charlie to play the steel guitar and seems to have been a general counselor to the young man. Although when interviewed after Manson's arrest, Karpis said that he had considered Manson the last man on earth to, quote, go into the mass murder business. Charlie was hooked on this new thing called Scientology, says Karpis. He figured it would enable him to do anything or be anything. Maybe he was right. The kid tried to sell a lot of other cons on Scientology, but got strictly nowhere. Scientology is a reincarnationist religion that claims to train individuals to experience past lives, to leave their bodies, etc., i.e. exteriorize, and to achieve great power and immortality, among other things. Manson learned about Scientology from one Lanier Raymer, from Gene Deaton, and from Jerry Millman, who was Manson's roommate at McNeil Island Penitentiary. Lanier Raymer, according to Manson followers, had been active in the study of Scientology and had become a doctor of Scientology, an early rank in the movement, now abolished. Raymer broke away from Scientology and formed his own group. Also, I'm going to show you in part 2 how Raymer was also, there was a whole file kept on his ass because Scientology was, again, trying to keep intel on anybody that had anything to do with Manson and Scientology, and since Raymer's the one that introduced him to it, they had a whole record, which I have from the church, that they kept on him. Raymer broke away from Scientology and formed his own group. He was apprehended for a shotgun holdup and was sent to McNeil Island. Manson had told a jailhouse visitor that he received 150 sessions, it's actually 150 hours, of processing in jail, evidently from Lania Raymer. And 150 hours is a shitload of auditing, by the way, guys. I've definitely done thousands of hours, but 150 is quite a bit and would definitely do something to your mind. Manson has contended that he learned Scientology methods very quickly because his mind, quote, wasn't programmed. But Manson was not a product of Scientology in any way. I would kind of disagree with that. Maybe you'll see more as we go and you make up your own mind. He merely borrowed a few ideas from it. The Scientologists call it squirreling, that is, borrowing and mutating Scientology practices or methods. Manson picked up a fair number of Scientology phrases and practices, which he put into his own use when he began to reorganize the minds of his young followers. Phrases like, quote, to mock it up and cease to exist and to come to now, and the concept of putting up pictures or mocking up pictures, all seem to have their origin in Manson's McNeil Island sessions with Lanier Raymer. Manson also studied Masonic lore and picked up some knowledge of Masonic hand signs, which later he would flash to judges during court appearances. Not a bad thing to do, but apparently it didn't work for Manson. He evidently learned something about Scientology recognition signals. Later, in the area of creepy crawls, Manson would develop his own complex system of hand and body signals, really a whole language of chop notation among his followers. And we showed in the series how he did the hand mimicry, something called CCHs. I won't drive you crazy with the nomenclature, but communication, control, and havingness was one of the drills where he'd run up to the kids on the ranch and he would have them, he'd move around like he was like this amazing dancer, so to speak. And he would have people try to mimic or copy him. That came directly from Scientology, as well as theater games and such, which is probably where Hubbard stole it from. So, getting back to this. Within months, Charlie was playing his music in bars in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. So, again, he's out of jail. You've seen some of the antics and the training he was getting in jail, along with how to win friends and influence people and other things. And now he gets out, and within months, Charlie was playing his music in bars in San Francisco's Tenderloin district and gathering a large and devoted group of followers. Now, again, just real quick, guys, we covered in detail how his parole officer, let me pull this off here. His parole officer was named Roger Smith, and I'm sorry, his parole, the parole officer shit and how he got out so quickly and was allowed to move to San Francisco is covered in the Summer of PSY-OPS episodes, and we'll be getting deeper into that when we get into that. But he didn't have permission to go to San Francisco, but he was being protected by his parole officer. Okay, back to this. Okay, so after he gets out, he's playing music at the Tenderloin district and gathering a large and devoted group of followers. In this brief period of freedom, he lived with and associated with hundreds of different people, many of them prominent in the entertainment industry. He made numerous contacts in the music business, including Dennis Wilson, Neil Young, and Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day and the former occupant, along with Candace Bergen, of the Cielo Drive home where the Tate murders occurred. Charlie even reportedly served as a religious consultant. That's actually not true about the Monkees and shit. There's a rumor that he auditioned for the Monkees, but that would have been impossible because he was actually in prison at the time. He was also deeply involved in a number of criminal enterprises well before the consecutive bloodbaths that thrust him into the national spotlight. As author Joel Norris has noted, Charlie was a drug dealer and contract killer and had become involved in the underworld crime, murder for hire rings, and child pornography. More to say on that when we get to the actual killings. Interesting enough, Manson has said that the family's most well-known victims were involved in some of the same enterprises. Quote, "Don't you think those people deserve to die? They were involved in kiddie porn." Charlie had previously noted, allied himself with various satanic cult groups that, as Norris notes, were, quote, heavily based on ritual bondage, sacrifice, and also murder. According to Ed Sanders, who interviewed numerous members and associates of the family, Manson was also involved in the production and distribution of snuff films. We'll get more into that, and that also ties into one of the shootings during the David Berkowitz spree that was filmed and used for the same purposes. This is so disturbing, man. Again, if you're just joining us, trigger warning, because this is kind of dark shit that we're talking about here. In the aftermath of the Tate and LaBianca murders, the LAPD, one of whom officers co-owned the auto shop that Charlie lived in just a few months before the murders, couldn't really be bothered with the wealth of evidence that implicated family members in the murders. The department also refused to acknowledge and examine the obvious connections between the two murder scenes, severely hampering the investigation. They likewise refused to explore the connections between the murder of musician Gary Hinman and the other two more high-profile crimes. The LA Sheriff's Department had already solved the Hinman case, no thanks to the LAPD, and had taken Bobby Beausoleil into custody just a few days before the Tate murders. The sheriffs knew of his connections to the family and of the connections between the three crime scenes. Two motorcycle gang members with close ties to the family, Al Springton and Danny DiCarlo of the Straight Satans, had given the sheriffs damning testimony concerning the family's involvement in all three murders. DiCarlo, who was reportedly a member of the Process Church, appears to have provided security for Charlie and the family. He kept a large arsenal of weapons at the family compound, including a .303 British Enfield rifle, a .22 rifle, a 20-gauge shotgun, a 30 caliber carbine, a 12-gauge riot gun, an M1 carbine, and submachine gun. The family, it should be noted, did not operate as the hippie cult that they have been portrayed as being. Their base of operations was more of a paramilitary compound than it was a commune, complete with guard shacks at lookout points, telescopes, walkie-talkies, military field telescopes, and converted dune buggies equipped with machine gun mounts. And also remember, they're on the Spawn Ranch, which is a movie set, which is quite interesting as well. When the sheriffs pass along to the LAPD the information they had obtained from their informants, LA's finest proceeded to do absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, on September 1st, 1969, just a few weeks after the Tate murders, a .22 caliber revolver was found in Sherman Oaks and turned into the LAPD. The gun was a rather rare and unique firearm and just happened to match the description of the weapon suspected of being used in the killings, right down to the broken handle that provided a perfect fit for the handle pieces that were recovered at the murder scene. Nevertheless, the department tagged and filed the weapon, and it was promptly forgotten for months. The department later sent out a flyer with a photo of the weapon, failing to realize that they had already had the gun in custody. Bumbling idiots, or is this planned? Or is Charlie being protected? It took a phone call from the father of the boy who had found the gun to get the department to acknowledge its existence, and even then, the caller was initially told that the gun had probably been destroyed. That's like the most important piece of evidence, and it seems like it got brushed off. Elsewhere, family member Susan Atkin had been arrested on unrelated charges and was spending time in the Sybil Brand Institute for Women. And as we know, while there, she gave detailed confessions of the murder to at least 2 fellow inmates. She claimed that the family had already committed 11 murders and, quote, many more were going to die. Both of these women tried to pass this information along to the LAPD, but both were repeatedly denied permission to do so. This was in spite of the fact that one of the female jailers to whom these reporters were made, these requests were made, was at the time dating one of the Tate case homicide detectives. One of the inmates later said, quote, it was the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in my life, to get anyone to listen to me. It would appear then that the LAPD had, among other evidence, all of the following at their disposal: the eyewitness account of a participant in the crimes, the gun used in the crimes, and the statements of 2 close associates of the killers directly implicating them in the crimes. Yet they chose not to act on any of this for a period of several months. Though no serial killer / mass murderer in history has likely achieved the level of notoriety or generated the volume of media coverage that Charles Manson has, many of the most compelling facts of the Manson case remain largely unknown to the public. Of particular significance, perhaps, are the myriad levels on which the killers and the victims were connected. One of these connections was provided by none other than Anton LaVey. At least one of Charlie's girls, known locally as the Witches of Mendocino, was recruited for LaVey's Church of Satan. Susan Sexy Sadie Atkins was one of many dancers in LaVey's stable, collectively known as the Topless Witches Review. Atkins later credited LaVey with starting her down the road to murder. Family member Bobby Beausoleil, who was a roommate and by some accounts a lover of child star turned underground filmmaker Kenneth Anger, was also recruited from the Church of Satan. Interestingly enough, LaVey had connections to the victims as well. He had formed a close association with Roman Polanski shortly before the murders when he served as a technical consultant for Roman Polanski on the film Rosemary's Baby, in which he also made a cameo appearance as, who else, Satan. We talked about this in a video that I did with Marcus, where we talked about John Travolta and Tom Cruise and how they got involved in Scientology. And the very first movie that John Travolta ever did was called The Devil's Reign. And there's a picture of him with his arm around Anton LaVey that you can see in that, where he also was consulting on that. Maybe you have to do a satanic movie or something to get your jump in Hollywood, because right after that, he got Welcome Back Kotter. On the set of an earlier film, Tate herself, this is Sharon Tate, had reportedly been initiated into witchcraft by Alexander Saunders. Sammy Davis Jr., who was introduced to the Church of Satan by Manson victim Jay Sebring, has said of the victims who were killed at Tate's Cielo Drive residence, quote, "Everyone there had at one time or another been into Satanism. Some newspaper reports at the time of the slayings denounced as sensationalism, were rife with reports that the Polanskis were Satanists who hosted drug and sex orgies." I don't know if they were Satanists, but they definitely did host those orgies. And shortly before the actual murders, they had a whipping down of one of the people over a drug deal gone bad at the house. And there was many, many people there to watch that. They got up to some funky shit. And they also found sex tapes with famous Hollywood celebrities at the Tate Polanski residence, but they mysteriously disappeared after that once they got into the police's hands. Indeed, just days before the murders, a drug dealer was reportedly filmed being whipped at the house in an S&M ritual. Various celebrities were said to have been in attendance. Actor Dennis Hopper spoke in interviews of sadistic movies filmed at the house that featured some of Hollywood's biggest names. Gee, where have we heard this shit before? Rings of Epstein, anyone? Another connection was provided by the Esalen Institute. I think we touched upon this in the last one. A, quote, New Age retreat in Monterey with ties to Crowley enthusiast Timothy Leary's like-minded Himalaya Academy. See how everything connects to everything else? I think we covered Timothy Leary as well. And then that also ties into Aldous Huxley, too, who we talked about a couple episodes back. Manson had ties to both. He had, in fact, visited Esalen, where Robert de Grinstead of the Process Church reportedly lectured occasionally. Just a few days before the Tate killings, on the very day of the murders, someone from within the Polanski home placed a call to the Institute for reasons unknown. One of the victims, Abigail Folger, may have visited the retreat just a few days before Manson's visit. And we're also going to get into Hubbard too, and this is kind of a piece of it about how, again, everything connects to everything else. Author Robert Heinlein was also reportedly invited to lecture at Esalen. Heinlein, who, like Hubbard, first gained notice penning pieces for astounding science fiction, is probably best known as the author of the 1961 novel Stranger in a Strange Land. The book provided The book provided Manson with a Crowley-inspired script to follow, and it was one of the few books that Charlie allowed his disciples to read. Heinlein was a right-winger with strong authoritarian leanings, who to this day, nevertheless, continues to be promoted by various voices in the progressive community. Another link between the principals in the case was provided by singer Mama Cass Elliot. This will tie into the Laurel Canyon scene in the next video. Victims Wojtek Frykowski and Jay Sebring, who had a history of sadism, were both part of Cass's clique, as were Manson and some of his followers. Cass Elliot was sort of had parties at her house, just like they did at Cielo, and was known as Mama for a reason. She was looked up to by most of the people in the Laurel Canyon scene and was known as sort of the mother figure. Victim Abigail Folger may have been as well. Folger had been known to be friends at time with Charles Manson himself, as well as with convicted Cotton Club killer Bill Menser, and that ties into when we get into the Son of Sam stuff in New York. 4 of the LAPD's top initial suspects in the Tate murder case were members of Cass Elliott's inner circle. They remain, including Terry Melcher, by the way, that's another story for another time. They remain prime suspects for the first month of the investigation. One member of that circle was Pick Dawson, the flamboyant son of a U.S. military State Department official and on-and-off boyfriend of Cass. Dawson had lived in the house of victims Frykowski and Folger in the summer before the killings, while the ill-fated pair house sat for the Polanskis and the future crime scene, 10050 Cielo Drive, later renumbered, appropriately enough, 10066 Cielo Drive. Another connection between killers and victims was provided by their shared interest in drug trafficking. Several, and we talked about in one of the videos how L. Ron Hubbard Jr. would talk about his father's drug importations as helping to fund Scientology, including Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Sharon Tate herself, were linked to the trafficking of hallucinogens. Rosemary LaBianca was a known trafficker of methamphetamine and likely other drugs as well. Frykowski had reportedly secured a deal just before the murders that would have made him an exclusive distributor of MDA in the LA area, his operations financed with coffee heiress Folger's considerable financial resources. Jay Sebring, who before the murders had once appeared in an underground movie that also featured Mansonite Bobby Boussalet, appears to have been involved in the drug trade as well. And there's some speculation that Sebring's hairstyling place was just sort of a kind of a front for those drug transactions. A man named Joel Rostow is known to have delivered drugs to Sebring at the Cielo house just hours before the murders. Rostow was found murdered the next year in New York City. Another Sebring associate showed up dead just a month later in Florida. Immediately following the killings on Cielo Drive, Sebring's house was thoroughly cleaned by friends before police arrived to conduct a search. The Manson family was also heavily involved in drug dealing, including trafficking in LSD, hashish, marijuana, and cocaine. Just a couple of days after the killings, Manson was seen driving a black Mercedes-Benz, possibly owned by an underling of a man named Ronald Stark. Around that same time, Stark assumed the role of banker for the, quote, Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a tax-exempt church that was formed by a motorcycle gang with close ties to Timothy Leary. That's the tune in, tune out, and whatever the hell, guy that kind of started all this shit, whose quote is saying that the CIA was responsible for the 60s, basically, and he was an asset. This might be a good time to show a little video clip. So the Brotherhood was led by a man named Farmer John Grills. I feel like I've been reading forever, so I will show you a little bit, another movie clip, and they will show you a little bit more about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love and such, and we'll kind of be able to take a break here without me just sitting here reading. And I can riff off of some of the things that are in this little documentary. So let me play this for you guys. It's about a 10-minute thing, and then we can jump off. We can jump back to where we were. And you'll have, as they say in Scientology, the mass on the subject, rather than just some idiot endlessly reading. This speculates on how Manson was a CIA asset and how he came to be able to control his flock with his incredible hypnotic powers.
However, the most curious and troubling aspect of Manson was his inexplicable ability to control the minds of his followers.
They called themselves the Family. They came and went, and the number varied from 20 to 30. Police said they were a pseudo-religious cult.
Manson used some of the same mind control techniques the CIA was developing at the time under Project MKUltra, such as hypnotism, LSD, trauma, and other types of mental conditioning to turn disaffected suburbanites into programmed killers. But where did he learn such skills? Upon deeper inspection, the whole story reeks of an intelligence operation, especially to those familiar with the CIA's obsession with mind control. A former Manson family member described Manson's intent to systematically kidnap and program children.
Well, Charlie was trying to take over this religious organization called the Fountain of the World. Charlie wanted to use the fountain as a base of headquarters to go out and kidnap kids, bring them there, tune them in, or program them, or take them out to the desert.
Okay, here's another connection, the Fountain of the World cult. Let me see if I can find this. Okay, so check this out. This again is from Ed Sanders' book. Again, link in the description box. You can get a whole bunch of free books from PDF. And this is an amazing read, by the way. Another input into the mind of Manson was provided by a religious cult, the Fountain of the World, located west of the Spawn Ranch in Box Canyon near the Santa Susana Fire Department. He was very impressed with the fountain and spent a lot of time visiting it. Charlie was basically trying to form his own cult and his own religion. This is why he would send Bruce Davis and people off on missions to try to set up his own churches. And he was involved in so many different cults, not least in the Haight-Ashbury scene when this was a thing. And with his mind, he was trying to formulate his own cult. The Fountain of the World, a religious sect dedicated to, quote, peace through love and service, or so the sign on the hill above the cult corner reads, was an apocalyptic Christian cult that held public meetings every Saturday night. Several of the Spawn Ranch hands, including Shorty Shea, were associated with the Fountain of the World. Ranch hands would attend the Fountain's religious meetings and group song sessions. Manson and the family occasionally attended these meetings. A black guy named John was involved in the leadership at the Fountain of the World, and Manson several times hungered to take the place over. There you go. The cult members wore robes and practiced celibacy. Charlie assigned some of the girls to try to seduce the priests of the order, evidently to no avail. The fountain was formed by a holy man named Krishna Venta, who died by violence. The family grooved with the violent history of the fountain. The religious retreat occupied subterranean chambers and caves, wherein they did their thing. As the cult progressed, dissension ensued and parties unknown blew up the founder, Krishna Venta, and 9 of his followers, with 40 pieces of dynamite placed in the catacombs. This occurred on 12/10/1958, whereafter the fountain struggled onward, so it struggled onward and was still thriving when Manson discovered it. Charlie seems to have gotten the idea for his crucifixion ceremony from the Fountain of the World. There was a large rock at the Fountain of the World that looked remarkably like a huge skull. At the top of the skull was a wooden upright cross. Fountain members, so one is told, were wont to strap themselves up on the cross for penitential meditation sessions. Far out, man. Not far from the Spawn Ranch, the family discovered an almost secret clearing guarded by the natural surrounding wall of large boulders. On one side of the clearing was a hill, the Hill of Martyrdom. For upon this hilly boulder-shouldered secret clearing was performed perhaps the world's first outdoor LSD crucifixion ceremony. And any of you guys that know the Manson story know that he, part of what he did was pretend to be Jesus and actually acted out this cross ceremony minus the nails. There they snuffed Charlie in the role of Jesus, strapping, not nailing, him to an actual rustic cross, while others, acting as tormentors and apostles, jeered or wept. One chosen female was Mother Mary, cloaked and weeping at the foot of the cross. Then they fucked, evidently after some form of resurrection service. In August of 1968, part of the family spent about a week living at the Fountain of the World. There is talk that Manson gave about $2,000 of the money given to the family by Juanita to the fountain. At some point in its development, the family, particularly the girls, began to say, "Amen, amen," whenever Charlie spoke, as if his words were divine. Manson began to formulate obstinance tests for his followers, as when he was told Sadie Klutz during a meal to go get him a coconut, even if she had to go clear to Rio. She executed an about face and she trotted off to Rio. This is the power that he had over his flock. However, after a few steps, he called her back. Another time, it's just like being under hypnosis. Manson, programmed these people. And when he told them to do something, it doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. It's just like giving a hypnotic command to the subconscious and you act on it no matter how ludicrous. And there are stories of him actually sending people all across the world to just for the hell of it, man, just to see if they're under command. I'm thinking of a story of where L. Ron Hubbard, in one of his hypnosis things, he had a man put his hand on a bar, and he would suggest to him that it's getting hotter and hotter, and he's going to die if he doesn't take his hand off, but he can't take his hand off. And the guy was just sitting there in torment until Hubbard finally released the post-hypnotic command. However, after a few days, he called her back. Another time at a meeting at the Fountain of the World, when he was trying to impress the fountain members with the obeisance of his followers, he instructed little Paul to go spend a week on the cross, which little Paul darted off to do. But the wizard, Manson, showed mercy and called him back. Okay, Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's it on that. We will go back to this, right where we were, with the added bonus of a little bit of music in the background. Check in with you guys, see how you're doing. Am I on here? Yeah. If you compare that with Tom O'Neill's book, he goes into great detail about how Bugliosi was full of shit and how much he actually lied in his book. It's quite astonishing. And what a psychopath Bugliosi was too. Not only did he make up a lot of the story to fit his own agenda, but he was a very crazy person. I don't know, Mark, how many cults does it take to change a light bulb? Lady Veritas. There seems to be a blueprint throughout human history. It's hard to tell one corruption from another. Makes you wonder who's really pulling the strings. Exactly. That's kind of why we're hammering on the 60s and shit, lady, because I don't think the world and the way that things operate have necessarily changed. I just think that they become more perfected. And what do they say? If you don't learn from your past, you know, you're bound to repeat it or some shit like that. Well, here we are. Okay, carrying on. We were jumping off of here where the Brotherhood of Eternal Love is going to play a role in this little documentary that I might as well finish playing here too. This is just a quick way to kind of understand what the hell this is all about.
Manson maintained a seemingly endless supply of drugs for his cult, including a rare strain of LSD called Orange Sunshine, which came exclusively from a group known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, known to have well-established connections to the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, we took hundreds of trips together. With Charlie, he actually did almost like drug programming.
Conspiracy researchers speculate Manson was some sort of programmed guru, created by the CIA and set loose against what was seen as a new and subversive segment of society. Manson's neglectful and traumatic childhood would certainly have made him a likely mind control candidate. He was incarcerated at Vacaville State Pen, where CIA spooks were recruiting MKUltra test subjects at the time.
Want to hear something interesting? So you just said Vacaville State Prison, right? Now, how the hell does Scientology get itself into the prison system? All we have to do is ask Robert Von Young. Let me see if I can pull this up. So check this out. They had a system. I need to explain this a little bit before I pull this up. We talked about in the Raised in a Secret Society series how me and my dad used to grade lessons from inmates via a front group by Scientology called Criminon. Before that started around in the 70s. Before that, they would get Scientology into prison systems through differently named, but still using the same procedure as Criminon. And Robert Von Young, who has since spoken out, and he's featured on one of the episodes called The Bridge to Total Amnesia, where he's actually demonstrating to a news crew how the TRs work after he wakes up. He was actually at Vacaville, and he gives us a little bit of intel on how I don't think there's not much of a difference, by the way, between Scientology programming and MKUltra programming. So it's basically the same thing. And this is how he kind of they get him into the prison system under the nose of the guards and shit. So an ex-intelligence officer for Scientology, Robert Von Young, said, I was at staff at the Davis franchise from 1969 until 1971. Well, because of the work that I was doing in Davis, I started to do some public relations work as well as some other staff positions there, meeting the media. I was also running a program in Vacaville Prison, which is a medical facility that's just west of Sacramento. Happens to be the one where Charlie Manson was kept for a long time. That I would go in every week and hold a class in Scientology. We know Ted Kaczynski was also a victim of the MKUltra project, and as discussed in those episodes that I told you about, and I'm sure you guys know, the prison's top-level universities, including UCLA, Stanford University, which is where the murder of Arliss Perry, when we get to David Berkowitz, plays in, they were experimenting with people's minds in, completely illegally in Project MKUltra. That's what it was all about. And when they were finally, it was so compartmentalized, nobody knew about it. But ironically, L. Ron Hubbard did. In a 1951 book called Science of Survival, he tries to quote unquote expose MKUltra because somehow he was hip to this shit. And MKUltra wasn't officially formed until April of 1953. Coincidence or not, Scientology became incorporated in Camden, New Jersey in December of that same year, 1953. And since that one didn't take off very well, in February of 1954, they set up their real headquarters where it did kick off in Los Angeles. Sorry for the ramble. Hopefully you can see how the Project MKUltra was so compartmentalized that it wasn't known about until 1974 when they had congressional and state hearings. And even then, only a fraction of the information survived and 95% of it was destroyed. And even then, the number of projects that they did on unwitting people is incredible. So how big was the fucking project really? And the big question is it still going on today? So here we go. Back to the little documentary.
Researchers can only speculate as to what brainwashing Manson might have received. However, he certainly seems on board with the agenda.
You gotta have a one world government. You gotta have a one world court. There can be no place in the world that you can get away.
In the meantime, though, since that is probably a long way away,
well, not as far as you might think.
Well,
I'm going to kill you as many as I can. I'm going to pile you up to the sky. I figured about 50 million. If I could get about 50 million of you, I might be able to save my trees and my air and my water and my wildlife.
But it was his ties to a satanic cult that researchers believe ultimately motivated the Tate murders.
We have a weird homicide.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski.
According to author Barry Terry, Manson was affiliated with the Process Church, spending considerable time at the cult and borrowing ideas that would become part of his HELTER-SKELTER ideology.
There are people that maintain that Manson learned everything he knew from the process, like the apocalyptic ideas that they preached.
Well, a lot of the guys were interested in studying how to clear your mind. That's where Scientology started, and then it got to be the process.
John Todd spoke of Manson's affiliation with the Process Church.
Manson, the brotherhood that he belonged to, is called the Process.
And claimed Tate's murder was a cult sacrifice.
But that's what the Tate killings were about. The others just happened to be there. She wanted out, and you don't get out.
Sharon Tate LaBianca's murder, okay, was a witch's hitting. Sharon Tate wanted out, but the thing is...
What do you mean she wanted out? She was a witch?
Yes, she was tired of it. She wanted to get out.
You base those allegations on what?
On when I was in, myself. I'm not the only one who knows this information. Anybody who was in witchcraft during that time can tell you the same thing. If you remember, she was killed. One leg was strung up from the rafter, her hands behind her, her throat sliced open. There was a tarot, 78 cards in a tarot deck. You look at the 12th major arcana one, it looks like the hangman. That's exactly how Sharon Tate LaBianca was left.
There was blood everywhere. A rope tied twice around Sharon Tate's neck was looped over a beam and tied around Jay Sebring's neck.
Fulfilling Manson's commands to leave something witchy.
I said, if you're gonna do something, leave something witchy. Just like I would tell you, if you're gonna do something, do it well, and leave something witchy.
Only later would the world discover the true horrors that had been taking place within the Manson's demented family.
They sang together.
Okay. So you guys saw the stuff on the Brotherhood of the Eternal Love. You got a basic idea, and like I said, you can check out the whole documentary, which goes into also the Jim Jones cult. Okay, so we're almost done here. We'll probably be ending off in about 15 minutes. Just want to finish this. Around that same time, Stark assumed the role of banker for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a tax-exempt, quote, church that was formed by a motorcycle gang with close ties to Timothy Leary. The Brotherhood was led by a man named Farmer John Griggs at the group's ranch in Idlewild, California. A month earlier, a teenage friend of Leary's daughter had been found drowned at the ranch. The death of Griggs... This is just lovely shit, isn't it, guys? Jesus, hang on a second. Need to see a fucking puppy after this. The death of Griggs resulted in a massive shakeup at the organization that resulted in the shadowy Stark becoming the Brotherhood's sole banker and money manager. Under Stark's guiding light, the Brotherhood became the largest known producer and distributor of LSD in the world, producing some 50 million doses. Stark was also closely linked to a parallel acid-producing operation in the UK dubbed the Microdot Gang, which likewise produced millions of hits of LSD in the early 1970s. While running his empire, Stark was known to have extensive contacts with American embassy personnel and to have frequent visitors from both the British and the American consulates. And as you saw in that documentary, or maybe not because it was so skippy, there was CIA connections to the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was the main acid producer during this time. Were the Manson killings in reality part of what might be dubbed the Great Acid Coup of 1969? Were they a result of an operation aimed at, among other things, killing off some competitors, intimidating others, and consolidating control of the hallucinogenic drug market? The possibility clearly exists. Police originally were drawn to the theory that the killings were drug-related. Other early theories were that the killings were occult-inspired, or that the true motive could be found in what was dubbed fame porn. Perhaps it's all of them. Films and videos found at the Polanski home suggested an elite Hollywood wife-swapping operation. The Folger-Frykowski home also yielded a box of erotic photos of Hollywood's elite. Would that be maybe for blackmail material? There were also indications of the involvement of organized crime in the killings. Leo LaBianca had known underworld connections to whom he reportedly owed nearly $250,000 in gambling debts. At the time of the murders, the LaBianca home, which I must add perhaps gratuitously was once owned by Walt Disney, was known to have its phone lines tapped. I could also add here, perhaps rather gratuitously as well, that Walt Disney was a direct descendant on his mother's side of George Burroughs, reportedly the, quote, Grand Wizard of the witches executed in Salem in 1692. One mistaken impression that many people have about the Manson case is that the homes where the attacks took place were largely chosen at random. That was hardly the case. Manson was very familiar with the Polanski Tate home, which he had visited in the past. Manson knew both the owner of the Cielo Drive home, Rudy Albelli, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, Altabelli, and the previous tenant, Terry Melcher, who along with Charlie was involved with the Process Church, as was John Phillips, that's Papa John Phillips, who was the one of the singers in the Mamas and the Papas along with Cass Elliot, and he's the father of Bijou Phillips, who is the wife of convicted rapist Danny Masterson, Cass Elliott's bandmate and another associate of Manson. Charlie was familiar with the LaBianca home as well. It was right next door to the home of Harold True, who had hosted LSD parties attended by Charlie and his followers before the murders. One particularly bizarre fact about the Tate killings that has gone largely unreported is that the crime scene appeared to have been rearranged after the killers had left. An attempt appeared to have been made to pose the victims' bodies on the home's front porch, after which the corpses were reposed inside the house. That very beginning article by Miles Mathis goes into that more, and again, I'll link that in the description because that appears to have happened, and that's quite unusual. Evidence of tampering with the crime scene included an unidentified bloody boot heel print found on the front porch of the house, and a number of unidentified fingerprints on the premises. Really? Manson was ultimately arrested on charges unrelated to the murders on October 12th, Aleister Crowley's birthday, following a raid on the family compound, and was only later charged in connection to the killings. Charlie had previously been arrested or charged on 40 or more occasions. One of those arrests in 1967 was made by narcotics teams led by LAPD's Frank Salerno. Salerno would later lead the task force investigating both the Hillside Strangler murders and the Night Stalker killings. And when we get into part 2, you'll see the interconnections of everything from Louis Jolyon West to other people that were very closely involved in not just one suspected murder or high-profile case, but many. When the Manson case came to trial, there were the usual strange occurrences that seemed to plague serial killer trials. The lead defense attorney, Ronald Hughes, had just passed the bar and yet to try a single case. He was, needless to say, a rather odd choice to spearhead the defense of one of the most vigorously prosecuted and high-profile murder cases of all time. Hughes soon went missing and later turned up dead on the very day that death sentences were returned by the jury. Family member John Philip Zero Hot, not charged with playing a role in the murders, also turned up dead, allegedly after playing a game of Russian roulette. Another member of the family was whisked away to Patton State Hospital, which was reportedly deeply immersed in overt behavior modification experiments in the 1970s. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the trial was that the defense team rested their case without bothering to actually present one. Courtroom viewers were stunned when not a single witness was called to rebut the prosecutor's case, thereby virtually guaranteeing a win for Bugliosi and the state. Also of note is that then President Richard Nixon declared Manson guilty on national television, nearly causing a mistrial, but ultimately greatly aiding the prosecution's efforts. When it was all over, Judge Order pronounced death sentences for Charlie, Patricia Kremwinkle, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten. The sentences were delivered on, of all days, April 19, 1971. The year before, Bobby Bousselet had become the first family member to receive a death sentence when the jury trying him returned the sentence in the Gary Hinman murder trial. The date was April 21st, 1970. Here's an important point, and we're getting close to ending off this particular segment here. This is really interesting. So, perhaps in no other serial killer case has the subject of mind control played a more central role. That Charlie had a remarkable ability to control his followers is a well-established and widely acknowledged fact. Even more remarkable is that Manson has maintained much of that control from inside a prison cell for over 30 years now, and we know obviously he's died since the writing of this book. In fact, the control that he had over his disciples was the primary basis for Manson's murder convictions. While it was Charlie's face that came to symbolize the killings, he did not personally participate in the Tate LaBianca murders. According to the official version of events, he was not even present at the crime scenes when the murders took place. He merely suggested to his followers what they should do, and they obligingly followed his commands. In order to convict Manson then, it was necessary for the prosecution to convince the jury that the actual killers were virtually powerless to disobey their leader. For this reason, the Manson trial had no real precedent in American legal history. What the Manson case demonstrated was that it could be proven in a court of law that a person could be compelled to essentially act against his or her will. That had already been established in a Danish court in a landmark case recalled by Esterbrook's in Hypnotism. This is a point I made on one of the very first episodes when I first started talking out about this shit. Scientology practices covert hypnotism without a license, completely illegally, and why can't they be prosecuted since there's been a precedent set with the Manson case? Why can't they be prosecuted for hypnotizing people without their consent? So with that in mind, by the way, this George Easterbrook's book on hypnotism is very telling, and there'll also be a free PDF of that book in the description box a few hours after the video publishes. An amateur hypnotist named Nielsen had induced a hypnotic subject named Hardrup to commit a murder. Nielsen, the hypnotist, got a life sentence, a maximum penalty in Denmark. Okay, so this is kind of an unprecedented, wrong one. It's kind of unprecedented, that they actually got Manson for hypnotism, where, if the people were, what he's saying here is if the people were hypnotized and were acting, without their own kind of knowledge or consent, then they shouldn't be held as responsible or responsible at all. And Charlie should be the one that's being prosecuted. But instead, they all kind of got the rap, which is a contradiction in the case that Bugliosi was kind of making a point about. It's very interesting. So an amateur hypnotist named Nielsen had been induced in a hypnotic subject named Hardrup to commit a murder. Nielsen, the hypnotist, got a life sentence, the maximum penalty in Denmark, whereas Hardrup, the actual murderer, received a 2-year sentence on the basis of temporary insanity. The Manson case had a slightly different outcome. Manson, the hypnotist, received the death penalty, the maximum sentence in the state of California, and so did the actual murderers. Legally and logically, that verdict made little sense, for if Manson's control was so complete that the killers were powerless to resist his commands, then they should not have been held legally accountable for their actions. And if Charlie did not wield such power, then he should not have been held responsible for the actions of others. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, who also wrote the best-selling novel HELTER, did not address that inherent contradiction in his prosecution strategy in his widely read book, HELTER. He did ponder, albeit briefly, how Manson gained such control over his subjects. He concluded that remains, quote, the most puzzling question of all. Indeed, after spending just a few pages briefly summarizing some of the techniques Manson employed on its followers, Bugliosi commented, I tend to think there's something more, some missing link that enabled him to so rape and bastardize the minds of his followers, that they would go against the most ingrained of all commandments, thou shalt not kill, and willingly and even eagerly murder at his command. Charlie himself once gave an indication of how he controlled his flock. Quote, if you want to get to people and unlock their minds, the basic way you get them is through fear. Exactly. It's the biggest weapon that's used. That was a concept that borrowed from the teachings of the Process Church. In his summer 1969 interview, Beach Boys' Dennis Wilson spoke of getting the fear. In the same interview, he referred to Charlie as, quote, the wizard. While pondering the question of how Manson was able to exert such control, Bugliosi largely ignores a perhaps even more important question. Where did Charlie learn the techniques that he was so obviously skilled at? Bugliosi notes that only that it, quote, may be something that he learned from others, which of course is only stating the obvious. The question not asked, either in the book or at the trial, is, who were the others? One possible answer can be found among the personnel at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic in the late 1960s. Again, this has been discussed earlier, and I'm sure we'll be hitting upon this in the next one. Two employees of the clinic, Dr. Roger Smith, a research criminologist who had started the clinic's drug treatment program, and Dr. David Smith, who founded the clinic itself, were both involved in government-sponsored research on human behavior. Both had connections to Manson and his followers. In fact, Roger Smith was Charlie's parole officer. And as discussed in Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, he's the one that basically kept him out of prison despite many opportunities to throw him back in prison for, an extended period of time. Another question never addressed by Bugliosi is how it was possible that a man of limited education, who had spent the majority of his life behind bars, somehow acquired those skills while U.S. intelligence agencies, after investing countless millions of dollars in decades of research aimed at attaining that very same goal, have allegedly met with nothing but failure. I can tell you from being in Scientology, it's not met with failure. You absolutely can make somebody do something against their own will. You absolutely can. It defies explanation that men such as Manson or Jim Jones, David Koresh, etc., have stumbled upon a secret that the CIA has yet to discover. It is a patently absurd notion, and yet that is exactly what we are supposed to believe. We are also supposed to believe that Charlie, while controlling the actions of others, was himself acting on his own free will. That's highly unlikely. If Charlie was in fact controlling the family, the logical question to be asked at trial was, who was controlling Manson? Was Manson himself a puppet, as well as a puppeteer? That question naturally was never raised and so remains largely unanswered to this day. Perhaps Bugliosi felt that question unimportant, given that, according to his book, quote, the Manson case was, and remains, unique. Dr. Roger Smith saw things a little differently. In December 1969, he told Life magazine, quote, there's a lot of Charlies running around, believe me. Okay, so we finished with that one. Got one more little thing to show you. In terms of getting Charlie to be tried, here's what they kind of said in one of the documentaries regards the conspiracy to commit murder and why they were able to convict Charlie on the same the hypnotist on the same grounds as those who were hypnotized.
It took 42.5 hours of deliberating before the jury sent out word that it had indeed reached a verdict.
We sat there for a while before we notified the bailiff, just letting it all sink in. And then we called the bailiffs and said, we have a verdict.
The courtroom was packed as the jury foreman handed over the forms on which the decisions were written. The three girls on trial, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, grinned and talked among themselves. Charles Manson smiled and stroked his beard. Then the verdicts were read.
There's something called the California Conspiracy Rule that says any member of a conspiracy is equally guilty of any crimes committed by his co-conspirators. And Charlie was obviously the head of the conspiracy, so that's what got Charlie guilty. 7 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder.
Now, one final thing, which is going to leap us off into whenever we end up doing part 2. There'll be other videos in between this, but we got a few videos to do on this section to wrap it up, or we haven't even actually started to get into it. Hopefully you can see some connections being made because we really have just kind of just started. It's so, remember that quote at the beginning, how the Manson story is so hard to tell because there's so many different avenues and connections. Hopefully you're starting to see that. And I tried to put this in some form where it somewhat makes sense, but we have to jump around a lot. But this is a perfect place to tie it into Scientology and end off for here. Do some questions or whatever. I started some of your guys' stuff. If you have any questions, please throw them in the chat now, and then we'll read this real quick. This is about probably a 5-minute read. So, another disciple of Crowley. Again, this ties into the one that we did on the Occult Odyssey of L. Ron Hubbard to get some kind of context for this. But it also, of course, seems to, it's a good summary of what we've talked about so far. Another disciple of Crowley and an occult superstar in his own right was rocket fuel scientist Jack Parsons. In 1939, Parsons joined the Agape Lodge of the OTO in Pasadena, California, where he also helped found the prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And it's been theorized by some that stands for Jack Parsons Laboratories, JPL. The Agape was the only OTO lodge in the States at that time, though there was an active lodge in Vancouver started by Charles Stanfield Jones. In 1942, Parsons took the magical name of Freighter 210 and assumed leadership of the Pasadena Lodge with the blessings of Crowley. Parsons led the branch of the German-based pro-Nazi order throughout the war years, while at the same time working on highly classified military projects purportedly aimed at defeating the European fascist powers. And Crowley himself was an asset of British intelligence, MI6. One of his earlier recruits and most avid disciples had just served with the U.S. Navy in the Pacific and was the son of a naval commander. Calling himself Freighter H, he claimed at various times to work for the Los Angeles Police Department, the FBI, and the Office of Naval Intelligence. In truth, he may very well have worked for all of them. Freighter H, perhaps better known as L. Ron Hubbard, soon became Parsons' right-hand man. In 1946, the two adepts performed an allegedly important ritual that they have dubbed the Babylon Working. And I'm sure you guys know all about that. That's probably been talked about to death by people, covering this, so we won't bore you with that. And it's also been covered on the series. 2 years later, following the death of Mentor Crowley, Parsons took the oath of the Antichrist and took on an elaborate new name, Belarian Armeluis Antichrist. His Pasadena mansion served as the lodge's Templar. Leadership of the OTO had, for the time being, been passed by Crowley into the hands of Karl Germer, a former Nazi spy. Hubbard, meanwhile, parted ways with Parsons and by 1950 had launched the Hubbard Dianetics Research Foundation in New Jersey. In May 1950, Astounding Science Fiction, a pulp magazine, introduced Dianetics as a purportedly new science. Within weeks, Hubbard's book had hit the bestseller list. In 1952, he moved his operation to Phoenix and renamed it the HAS, or the Hubbard Association of Scientologists. In June of that same year, just 2 days short of the summer solstice, Parsons allegedly blew himself up while at work in his private home lab. When informed of her son's death, his mother promptly committed suicide. So Parsons' mother also apparently committed suicide. And there's rumors surrounding Parsons' death that named L. Ron Hubbard, Howard Hughes, and Randolph Hearst as possible suspects. In 1953, the Church of Scientology was formally incorporated in Los Angeles. Again, it was actually February of 1954. They first became incorporated in Camden, New Jersey in December of 1953, and then moved to LA. The group grew quickly over the succeeding years, particularly in the late 1960s, when membership quadrupled with the addition of such members as Charles Manson. By 1967, Hubbard's empire included command of a fleet of ships. Though the Church of Scientology has worked hard to gloss over its occult roots, its founder's own son, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., had been quoted as saying, "Hitler was involved in the same black magic and the same occult practices that my father was, the identical ones. My father thought of himself as the B666 incarnate. When Crowley died in 1947, my father then decided that he should wear the cloak of the beast." And also, Jack Parsons, his quote, very good his good friend, or the guy that he actually screwed over, Parsons also claimed to be the Antichrist, so maybe Hubbard had a problem with that. There seems to have been lots of that going around. L. Ron Hubbard Jr. has also said that, quote, "The one super secret sentence that Scientology is built on is, do as thou wilt." In the early 1960s, two high-ranking members of the Church of Scientology, Robert Moore and Mary Ann McLean, better known as the Grimstons, split off from London's Hubbard Institute to form the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a group whose official logo is a modified swastika, and whose literature included glowing tributes to Nazism, Satan, gore, and necrophilia. The group's bookstore reportedly stocked titles on topics such as Hitler, organized crime, hypnosis, brainwashing, and the occult. Moore, a former cavalry officer and the grandson of a British vicar, and McLean, a one-time prostitute who was connected to the Profumo scandal and who reportedly believes that she is the reincarnation of Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, first left London with their followers just after the summer solstice of 1966, arriving first in Nassau and then in Ixtal, Mexico. Again, that was covered earlier. That's when they really developed their philosophy. They were soon back in London. By 1967, they had arrived in the States, first setting up shop in New Orleans, French Quarter, where the organization was formally incorporated with the assistance of a former lawyer for the Catholic Church. In March 1968, the group moved their base of operations to San Francisco, taking up residence not far from LaVey's Church of Satan and various other occult groups, including a branch of the OTO. Recruiters for the group had been in the Bay Area since the 1967 Summer of Love, signing on such members as Brother Eli, a member of the Gypsy Jokers biker gang whose home/process church temple was located just 2 blocks away from the home of the Manson family. And then also located on that same block was the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. From its inception, the process made no effort to hide its infatuation with death, destruction, and cultural terrorism. In the essay Jehovah on War, Moore commanded his followers, "Thou shalt kill." Another essay that appeared in the official process publication urged readers to experience the pleasures of grave robbing and necrophilia. A rant in the death issue was penned by a recent transplant to the Bay Area by the name of Charles Manson. Also by 1967, the process had already spawned at least one spinoff, probably from the group's inner circle, reportedly known as the Omega. And then it says here real quick that the process church is alive and well today after a series of name changes. The group first became the Foundation Church of the Millennium, then the Foundation Faith of God, then the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary, and finally the Best Friends Animal Society, which today has its headquarters on a compound in the Utah desert. The group, which still includes many original members, is known to rub shoulders with various Hollywood celebrities, and that sanctuary is a cash cow, by the way. They bring in millions of dollars a year. So one of the offshoot groups that we talked about earlier, the Process Church, is the 4P movement, or the 4Pi cult, or the Chingon cult. The group's logo is a stylized swastika composed of 4 Ps. Its members are said to share a fascination with Nazi racist doctrines. Author Michael Newton has written, quote, "If law enforcement spokesmen are correct, the cult is also deeply involved in white slavery, child pornography, and the international narcotics trade. That often goes hand in hand with all of these cults, these more high-profile ones that seem to get away with literally murder. That has to do with snuff films, child pornography, and, of course, drugs. Not dissimilar to what Manson was involved in. The first branch of the cult was organized in Northern California and is said to have held its early gatherings in the Santa Cruz Mountains, adjacent to that boiling cauldron of satanic activity known as San Francisco Cauldron. From this primordial stew would arise in the late 60s the Manson family. And there was a lot of killings going on in the Santa Cruz area. We had Edmund Kemper and Herbert Mullen, where they pinned a lot of the murders on in the Santa Cruz areas that were happening in the early 70s. But that was a cauldron of activity. And that's kind of where the word serial killer first started to come from. California, specifically Santa Cruz and Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco scene, and the Laurel Canyon scene, because there were so many serial killers suddenly appearing. Much of Manson's ideology was taken directly from the teachings of the Process Church, with whom Charlie was closely connected, as alluded to by Bugliosi and Helter Skelter, and greatly elaborated on by Ed Sanders and the Family and Maitreya and the Ultimate Evil. Manson was exposed to the process as early as the spring 1967 at San Francisco's infamous Devil House, and he later claimed to have met the leaders of the process at the Polanski House, which he is known to have visited before the killings. Manson was also linked to, and here's a list: the Church of Satan, the Solar Lodge of the OTO, which operated from a ranch near Blythe and a cult-owned house near the University of Southern California campus, the Church of Scientology. Charlie declared himself to be a Theta Clear after 150 hours of auditing while in prison. A particularly bizarre group known as the Turkey Order of the Dog Blood, and a number of occult-oriented biker gangs, including the Straight Satans, who was once attended a Ku Klux Klan rally in the San Francisco Valley, the Satan Slaves, the Gypsy Jokers, the Jokers Out of Hell, and the Coffin Makers. Those last ones were biker gangs. Terry's evidence indicates that the family was itself a satanic cult, specifically a faction of the process-spawned 4Pi cult, and a sinister group to both the New York chapter and a sister group, sorry again for the Freudian slip, and a sister group to both the New York chapter, that's where the Son of Sam kicks in, said to be responsible for the Son of Sam slayings, and the Santa Cruz/San Francisco faction that may have been responsible for the Zodiac murders. Again, there was tons of activity during this time and lots of murders going on in Santa Cruz. and a lot of them were pinned just on Edmund Kemper, and Herbert Mullen more specifically. Herbert Mullen was probably also a MK Ultra target. The Manson family, appropriately enough, was also deeply involved in drug trafficking, just as Henry Lee Lucas claimed to be with the cult that he was in. Henry Lee Lucas claimed to be in a cult called the Hand of Death. It is not likely a coincidence that Henry's partner, Otis Toole, was known to have paid visits to the New Orleans headquarters of the Process Church. Jesus, it's a small world. With all that in mind, we now turn our attention to the San Francisco/Santa Cruz area and the explosion of violent murders that belched forth from the cauldron beginning in late 1960. Okay, mother of God, that's enough, man. I mean, it's so depressing actually reading this shit. But there you go, guys. I mean, that's some of the dark history of what was going on in the era of peace and love and hippies and shit. Let me smoke a cigarette and see what you guys have to say here. Bring up some questions, and then we'll roll out of here. I would like to give a quick shout out, if you don't mind. Let's do this little. I don't want to keep this thing up here the whole time because it's annoying. This little knowledge report thing kind of helps hide the microphone as well. But I did want to give a shout out for the people who were kind enough to contribute between last broadcast and this broadcast. Let's see. Hang on here. Let me remove the chat here for 1 second. Well, that's not necessary. Okay, yeah, thanks guys. I really appreciate it. The channel's not monetized. It's never going to be. So when you throw a little change over here, it helps pay for, obviously, the technical proficiency of this stream, because clearly I know what the hell I'm doing. But I just wanted to give a shout out to Jenna from California. Thank you. Jenna from Cali. I've been seeing you in the chat. Much appreciated, my friend. 8 points yet again. And Blue Sky Gal yet again. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated. Linda Ballard, a frequent contributor, also known as SD Cat Lover. Okay, good to know. I know who you are. Cricket became a member. Thanks, my friend. Roxy. And then if you want to be anonymous, you can go Kofi supporter, whoever that was. Thank you. Sharon. And Sharon, it looks like again, or those are two separate Sharons. Carrie Christopherson, and that's it for the last few days. Just wanted to say thanks on that. And let's get rid of this. Okay. I do have a few starred questions, which I'll fire off, but if you have anything you'd like to ask, please ask them now. Going back to the beginning of the stream, we have, that's not your computer delaying, by the way. It's still the lag on the camera or whatever. This is regarding earlier. What's up, Sai? Indie Scientologists are up to not too much good. Why? Because they derailed another person's finding, and that's no piss taking, apart from extraction from one's own urine. I know, too much for. I didn't see the continuation of that comment, but indie Scientologists are kind of bad in general, in my opinion, because they never move beyond getting this dude's madness out of their head and figure out, I don't know, man. There's so much to say about the indie Scientologists, but again, I refer people to the 10 steps out of Scientology if they really want to get this fucking mind virus out of their head. It doesn't mean it's all negative. It's just that indie Scientologists often never deprogram and carry that same ruthless, ridiculous Scientology mentality with them, not realizing it was basically a scam and bullshit. And there's a better way of thinking. Magic mushrooms are the only item that has reduced my PTSD symptoms from U.S. Army. I don't doubt that, Mark. Microdosing, or as Terrence McKenna would say, taking like what, huge ass fucking hits or something like that. Yeah, I've heard that mushrooms have been very effective, as well as marijuana. As well as marijuana in healing PTSD. I know that smoking weed definitely for a while helped me to recover from Scientology. Yeah, I do understand what you meant by the dates, my friend. There are a lot of interesting dates, and as you know, in the occult, dates, signs, and symbols, they all actually mean something. That's why certain rituals, of course, are carried out on certain dates and such. There was another thing in prison that Manson was actually introduced to that wasn't the process. Not sure what that means, Brad. What are you talking about? I'd like to know more. First time I read Helter Skelter, I was in Milwaukee, and the next morning, Dahmer was arrested. Coincidence? Jesus, child, what does that mean? Guys, let's try to decode that in the audience. Is Chow in any trouble on the spiritual plane? Also, Jeffrey Dahmer was executed the same day, or there's some connection that I'm forgetting right now between John Wayne Gacy. Maybe it was the day that Gacy was arrested. Dahmer was killed or something like that. There's something about that I forgot. Don, what's up, my friend? Yes, it is still going on today. Yeah, no shit. It's like the bringing in of the one world order, also known as the New World Order. But again, Don, you got to be careful talking about shit like that, especially on YouTube. You'll be called a conspiracy nutto, and they might take your channel down. This is like channel number 3 or 4 or some shit. Okay, finally, Mark, you give us the punchline of the joke on the earlier one. It takes 2 Colts to change a light bulb. You need 1 to hold the ladder. That's fucking good, dude. The ladder as in Scientology's bridge to total freedom, which is like a ladder. That's quite funny. Unless I misunderstood that. Doug, oh shit, I lost the chat. Hang on. Since we're winding down, I need to put on a better tune and turn it up a little bit. How about down tempo? That doesn't sound good. How about hip hop? Let's see what this sounds like. Hell yeah. Everybody put your hands up. Okay, I guess that's... Oh, shit. Let me go back to the messages. I did catch this. Actually, let me pull up the right one. Really just a weird coincidence. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I did read this. John Atack said that Manson had more auditing done than John himself in his 9 years in Scientology. Manson was full on Scientology. John got up to OT5, and I must have been a lot quicker back in the day or something, because 150 hours I blew just getting up to freaking grade 1. You know, they were, I did, it goes grade 0 to 4. Sorry to hit you with the terminology. It goes grade 0 to 4, new aerodynamics, then the state of clear, and then you do the OT levels 1 up through 8. And supposedly, or not supposedly, John did get up to OT5. How in the hell you can get up to OT5 doing less than 150 hours of auditing? It must have been very, very different back in the day. What's up, Jasper? PayPal and YouTube are not partisan either. They censor those on the left, right, and everything in between. Anything that threatens their profit or power. Yeah, exactly right, man. It's cool, YouTube, where anybody can kind of have a voice, but you do have to be careful about what you say, which really sucks and should show you, you know, I mean, the amount of censorship on YouTube, including comments where you can't even read people's replies. I often get people saying, are you deleting my comments? I'm not. I'm sure you guys know YouTube does a lot of funky shit. Another thing is I have another, not channel, but I have another account where I can check my own page, and it unsubscribes me like literally every week. So if you're getting unsubscribed, which is, I don't know if that's happening with all the channels or whatever, be sure to check back regularly, hit the bell or whatever the crap. I mean, I'm getting unsubscribed from my own freaking channel, so I don't know what's happening with you guys. Okay, here we go with the connection between Dahmer and Gacy, right? Vegan Dahmer was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Shaver on November 28th, 1994. Dahmer was 34 at the time. Yeah, but what's the connection to John Wayne Gacy? There was something about Gacy and stuff. Okay, my friends, we've been going forever. And I guess we'll end off here. Sooner or later, I'm definitely going to get a better outro.
Physical labor, and intense ideological study are used to break the subject's will. But is that the case?